spooky place.
Have you ever heard a whistle in the dead of night? One that didn't belong to the wind or any living thing. If you listen closely, you might hear it too, soft, melodic, and calling your name. But beware, because once you hear it, you won't be sleeping well tonight or ever again. Before we begin, I request you to like the video and subscribe to the channel. On that note, let's begin. The Whistling Man. Sarah had always been a curious child, the kind who couldn't resist testing the boundaries of the warnings she was given. Her grandmother's stories were the most intriguing, tales of spirits, curses, and things that lurked in the shadows. But the one that stuck with her the most was the story of the Whistling Man. Never whistle at night, Sarah, her grandmother would say, her voice low and grave. If you do, the Whistling Man will hear you. And once he hears you, he'll come for you. He doesn't stop until he finds you. Sarah had laughed it off, of course. She was 15 now, far too old to believe in such nonsense. But deep down, in the quiet corners of her mind, the story lingered like a splinter she couldn't quite remove. It was a Friday night, and Sarah was home alone. Her parents had gone out for the evening, leaving her with strict instructions to lock the doors and not let anyone in. The house was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that made her skin prickle. To fill the void, she turned on the TV, but the noise only made the emptiness feel louder. As the hours dragged on, Sarah grew restless. She wandered through the house, her footsteps echoing in the stillness. That's when she remembered her grandmother's warning. The Whistling Man. The idea was ridiculous, but something about the darkness outside made it feel possible. Feeling a surge of rebelliousness, Sarah decided to test it. Just once, just to prove to herself how silly it all was. She pursed her lips and let out a small, sharp whistle. The sound cut through the silence like a knife. For a moment, nothing happened. Sarah smirked, shaking her head at her own foolishness. But then, just as she was about to turn away from the window, she heard it, a faint, answering whistle from outside. Her heart skipped a beat. She froze, her eyes darting to the window. The curtains were drawn, but she could feel the darkness pressing against the glass. The whistle had been soft, almost melodic, but it sent a chill down her spine. "It's just the wind," she muttered to herself, though the night was perfectly still. Or maybe a bird. Yeah, a bird. But the sound had been too deliberate, too human. Sarah laughed nervously, trying to shake off the unease. She decided to go to bed, hoping sleep would erase the strange feeling creeping over her. At midnight, Sarah woke with a start. Her room was pitch black, the only sound the faint ticking of the clock on her wall. She lay there for a moment, trying to figure out what had woken her. Then she heard again, a whistle, clear and sharp, coming from just outside her window. This time, it was closer. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She sat up slowly, her eyes fixed on the window. The curtains swayed gently, though there was no breeze. The room felt unnaturally cold, as if the warmth had been sucked out of it. Her heart pounded as she reached for her phone, her hands trembling. She turned on the flashlight and pointed it at the window. The beam of light illuminated the curtains, but beyond them, there was only darkness. Then, the window creaked. It was a slow, deliberate sound, like someone or something was trying to open it. Sarah's mind raced. She had locked the window earlier, hadn't she? She couldn't remember. The creaking grew louder, more insistent, and she realized with a sinking feeling that the lock was turning. She scrambled out of bed, her phone slipping from her hand and clattering to the floor. The light went out, plunging the room back into darkness. The creaking stopped, and for a moment, there was silence. Then a low, guttural whistle filled the room. It wasn't coming from outside anymore. It was inside. Sarah's scream caught in her throat as she backed away from the window. Her legs hit the edge of her bed, and she stumbled, falling to the floor. The whistle came again, closer this time, and she could feel the air around her grow colder, heavier. She crawled toward the door, her hands slipping on the wooden floor. The whistle followed her, echoing in her ears, growing louder and more distorted. She reached the door and fumbled with the handle, her fingers numb with fear. It wouldn't open. The whistle was right behind her now, so close she could feel the breath of it on her neck. She turned, her back pressed against the door, and saw a shadow moving in the darkness. It was tall and thin, its shape shifting unnaturally, as if it were made of smoke. Two glowing eyes stared at her, unblinking. Sarah opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The shadow lunged at her, and everything went black. The next morning, Sarah's parents returned home to find the house eerily quiet. They called her name, but there was no answer. When they entered her room, they found her bed empty, the sheets tangled and thrown to the floor. The window was wide open, the curtains swaying gently in the breeze. On the floor, near the door, they found Sarah's phone. The screen was cracked, and the flashlight was still on, casting a faint glow. But what caught their attention was the faint whistling sound coming from the phone speaker. It was soft and melodic, almost like a lullaby. They tried to turn it off, but the sound wouldn't stop. And as they listened, they realized it wasn't just a whistle. It was a voice whispering Sarah's name. Days turned into weeks, and there was no sign of Sarah. The police searched the area, but they found nothing. Her parents were left with only the memory of that night, and the haunting whistle that still echoed in their minds. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind was just right, they would hear it again, a faint, answering whistle from somewhere outside. And they knew, deep down, that the whistling man was still out there, waiting for his next victim. Sarah's disappearance left a gaping hole in the small, close-knit community. Her parents were inconsolable, and her friends were haunted by the eerie circumstances of her vanishing. The police had no leads, no evidence, and no explanation. The only clue was Sarah's cracked phone, which continued to emit that faint, unending whistle. It was as if the device itself had been cursed, a chilling reminder of the night she was taken. But the story didn't end there. A week after Sarah's disappearance, her best friend, Emily, began to hear the whistle. It started softly, almost imperceptibly, like a distant echo in the back of her mind. At first, she thought it was her imagination, a side effect of the grief and fear that had consumed her since Sarah vanished. But the whistle grew louder, more insistent, until it was impossible to ignore. Emily tried to convince herself it was nothing. She turned on music, slept with the TV on, and even wore earplugs, but nothing drowned it out. The whistle was always there, a haunting melody that seemed to follow her wherever she went. One night, as she lay in bed, the whistle became so loud that it felt like it was coming from inside her room. She sat up, her heart pounding, and scanned the darkness. The room was empty, but the sound was unmistakable. It was coming from her closet. Trembling, Emily approached the closet door. Her hand hovered over the handle as the whistle grew louder, more distorted, as if it were being played through a broken instrument. She yanked the door open, half expecting to see Sarah standing there, but the closet was empty, except for a single, crumpled piece of paper on the floor. Emily picked it up with shaking hands. It was a note, written in Sarah's handwriting. The words were scribbled hastily, as if written in a panic. "He's coming. Don't whistle. Don't let him hear you." Emily's breath hitched. She dropped the note and backed away, her mind racing. How had it gotten there? She hadn't seen Sarah in days, and no one had been in her room. Before she could process what was happening, the whistle stopped abruptly, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. The next day, Emily told her parents about the whistle and the note. They dismissed it as a product of her grief and stress, but Emily knew better. She could feel it. The whistling man was real, and he was coming for her. That night, Emily decided to take matters into her own hands. Armed with a flashlight and her phone, she ventured into the woods behind her house. She had heard rumors of strange occurrences in the forest, whispers of a tall, shadowy figure that lurked among the trees. If the whistling man was out there, she was determined to find him and bring Sarah back. The woods were eerily quiet, the only sound the crunch of leaves beneath her feet. The beam of her flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating gnarled trees and twisted roots. As she walked deeper into the forest, the air grew colder and the silence became suffocating. Then she heard it, a faint whistle drifting through the trees. Emily froze, her heart pounding in her chest. The whistle was soft and melodic, but it sent a wave of dread through her. She turned toward the sound, her flashlight trembling in her hand. The beam of light caught something in the distance, a figure, tall and thin, standing perfectly still among the trees. Her breath caught in her throat. The figure didn't move, but she could feel its eyes on her, watching her from the shadows. The whistle grew louder, more distorted, until it sounded less like a melody and more like a scream. Emily turned and ran, her flashlight bouncing wildly as she sprinted through the woods. The whistle followed her, echoing in her ears, growing louder and more frantic with every step. She could feel the presence behind her, closing in, its breath cold against her neck. She burst out of the woods and into her backyard, slamming the door shut behind her. Her parents found her huddled in the corner of the kitchen, trembling and muttering about the whistling man. They tried to calm her down, but Emily couldn't stop shaking. She knew he was out there, waiting for her. The next morning, Emily was gone. Her parents found her bed empty, the sheets tangled and thrown to the floor. The window was wide open, the curtains swaying gently in the breeze. On the floor, near the door, they found her phone. The screen was cracked, and the flashlight was still on, casting a faint glow. But what caught their attention was the faint whistling sound coming from the phone speaker. It was soft and melodic, almost like a lullaby. They tried to turn it off, but the sound wouldn't stop. And as they listened, they realized it wasn't just a whistle. It was a voice whispering Emily's name. The disappearances didn't stop with Emily. Over the next few weeks, more people in the town began to hear the whistle. It started with Sarah's classmates, then spread to their families, and eventually to strangers who had never even met her. The whistle was always the same, soft and melodic at first, but growing louder and more distorted until it consumed them. Those who heard it would vanish without a trace, their beds left empty, and their phones emitting that haunting whistle. The town was gripped by fear, and no one dared to whistle after dark. But it didn't matter. The whistling man didn't need them to whistle. He only needed them to hear him. One night, Sarah's grandmother sat alone in her rocking chair, staring out the window at the dark woods beyond. She had always known the whistling man was real, but she had hoped the stories would be enough to keep him at bay. She had been wrong. As she rocked back and forth, she heard it, a faint whistle drifting through the trees. She closed her eyes and whispered a prayer, but the whistle grew louder, more insistent. The room grew cold, and the shadows seemed to shift and twist around her. When her family found her the next morning, her chair was empty. The window was wide open, the curtains swaying gently in the breeze. On the floor, near the chair, they found her phone. The screen was cracked, and the flashlight was still on, casting a faint glow. But what caught their attention was the faint whistling sound coming from the phone speaker. It was soft and melodic, almost like a lullaby. And as they listened, they realized it wasn't just a whistle. It was a voice whispering her name. The whistling man had claimed another victim, and he wasn't done yet. The town was in chaos. The disappearances had become an epidemic, and no one could explain it. The police were overwhelmed, the media was in a frenzy, and the townsfolk were paralyzed by fear. The whistling man had become a legend, a boogeyman whispered about in hushed tones. But for those who had heard the whistle, He was all too real. One day, while cleaning out Sarah's room, her mother found a journal hidden under the mattress. The pages were filled with Sarah's handwriting, but the entries were unlike anything she had ever written before. They were frantic, disjointed, and filled with terror. The first entry was dated the night Sarah had disappeared. I whistled. I shouldn't have, but I did. I heard him answer. He's outside my window. I can feel him watching me. I'm so scared. Grandma was right. He's real. The entries grew more disturbing as they went on. He's inside the house now. I can hear him moving through the halls. The whistle is everywhere. I can't escape it. I try to call for help, but my phone, it's broken. The whistle won't stop. The final entry was barely legible, the words scrawled in a panicked rush. He's in my room. I can see him. He's tall, so tall, and his eyes, they're glowing. He's coming for me. I don't want to go. Please, someone help me. The entry ended abruptly, as if Sarah had been interrupted mid-sentence. Her mother clutched the journal to her chest, tears streaming down her face. She had to know more. She had to find out what had happened to her daughter. Desperate for answers, Sarah's mother sought out an old woman named Agnes, who lived on the outskirts of town. Agnes was known as a witch, though no one dared to say it to her face. She was the only person who might know how to stop the whistling man. Agnes listened quietly as Sarah's mother told her about the journal and the disappearances. When she was finished, Agnes sighed and shook her head. The whistling man is no ordinary spirit, she said. He's a curse, born from the anger of those who were wronged in life. He feeds on fear and despair, and he won't stop until he's taken everyone who hears his call. Is there any way to stop him? Sarah's mother asked, her voice trembling. Agnes hesitated, then nodded. There is a ritual, but it's dangerous. You must go to the place where he was summoned and confront him. But be warned, if you fail, he will take you too. Sarah's mother didn't care about the danger. She would do anything to save her daughter and the others. Agnes gave her the instructions for the ritual in a small, intricately carved whistle made of bone. This whistle will call him to you, Agnes said, but it will also protect you if you use it wisely. Be careful. The whistling man is cunning, and he will try to trick you. That night, Sarah's mother ventured into the woods, following Agnes's instructions. She found the place where Sarah had last been seen, a clearing surrounded by gnarled trees, their branches twisted like grasping hands. The air was thick with tension, and the silence was deafening. She took a deep breath and blew the bone whistle. The sound was sharp and piercing, cutting through the stillness like a knife. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the temperature dropped, and the shadows began to shift. The whistling man appeared at the edge of the clearing, his tall, thin form silhouetted against the moonlight, his glowing eyes fixed on her, and a low, guttural whistle filled the air. Sarah's mother stood her ground, clutching the whistle tightly. I'm not afraid of you, she said, her voice shaking but determined. Let them go. Let them all go. The whistling man tilted his head, as if considering the words. Then he stepped forward, his movements unnaturally smooth. The whistle grew louder, more distorted, until it sounded like a cacophony of screams. Sarah's mother blew the bone whistle again, and the sound seemed to clash with the whistling man's call. He stopped, his glowing eyes narrowing. She could feel his anger, his rage, but she didn't back down. You don't belong here, she said. Leave this place and never return. For a moment, it seemed like the ritual was working. The whistling man began to fade, his form dissolving into the shadows. But then, he lunged at her, his long, bony fingers reaching for her throat. Sarah's mother stumbled back, dropping the whistle. The sound stopped abruptly, and the whistling man froze. She scrambled to pick it up, but it was too late. The whistling man was gone, and the clearing was silent once more. Exhausted and shaken, Sarah's mother returned home. She thought the ritual had failed, but the next morning, something strange happened. The disappearances stopped. The whistle was never heard again, and the town began to heal. But Sarah's mother couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She kept the bone whistle, just in case, but she never used it again. Years passed, and life returned to normal. The whistling man became a distant memory, a story told to scare children. But one night, as Sarah's mother lay in bed, she heard it, a faint, familiar whistle, drifting through the trees. Her heart stopped. She reached for the bone whistle, but it was gone. The whistle grew louder, more insistent, until it was all she could hear. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. The next morning, her bed was empty. The window was wide open, the curtains swaying gently in the breeze. On the floor, near the door, they found the bone whistle. It was cracked, and the faint sound of a whistle could be heard, soft and melodic, almost like a lullaby. And as they listened, they realized it wasn't just a whistle. It was a voice whispering her name. The whistling man had returned, and this time, he wasn't alone. The disappearance of Sarah's mother marked the beginning of a new wave of terror. The town, which had just begun to heal, was plunged back into chaos. The whistling man was no longer just a shadowy figure in the woods. He was a force of nature, an unstoppable curse that consumed everything in its path. But this time, something was different. The disappearances were no longer random. They were targeted, deliberate, and the whistle, it wasn't just a sound anymore. It was a message. One by one, people began to hear the whistle again. But this time, it wasn't just a haunting melody. It was a voice whispering names, dates, and locations. Those who heard it were compelled to follow its instructions, as if under a spell. A young boy named Tommy was the first to hear the new whistle. He was playing in his backyard when he heard it, a soft, melodic tune that seemed to come from nowhere. But as he listened, he realized it was saying something. Midnight, the old mill, bring the bone whistle. Tommy didn't know what it meant, but he couldn't ignore it. He told his parents, but they dismissed it as his imagination. That night, Tommy snuck out of the house and went to the old mill, clutching the bone whistle he had found in his mother's drawer. The mill was dark and abandoned, its windows shattered and its walls covered in ivy. Tommy hesitated at the door, but the whistle grew louder, more insistent. He stepped inside, and the door slammed shut behind him. The next morning, Tommy's parents found his bed empty. The window was wide open, the curtains swaying gently in the breeze. On the floor, near the door, they found the bone whistle. It was cracked, and the faint sound of a whistle could be heard, soft and melodic, almost like a lullaby. And as they listened, they realized it wasn't just a whistle. It was a voice whispering Tommy's name. As more people disappeared, a pattern began to emerge. The whistle was targeting specific individuals, those who had a connection to the original disappearances. Sarah's friends, her teachers, even the police officers who had investigated her case. It was as if the whistling man was tying up loose ends. But the most disturbing discovery came when a group of teenagers stumbled upon a hidden chamber beneath the old mill. The walls were covered in strange symbols, and the floor was littered with bones. In the center of the room was an altar, adorned with candles and offerings. And standing around the altar were the missing, Sarah, Emily, Tommy, and the others. But they were no longer themselves. Their eyes were blank, their movements mechanical. They were chanting in unison, their voices blending into a low, guttural whistle. The teenagers tried to run, but the door slammed shut behind them. The missing turned as one, their glowing eyes fixed on the intruders. The whistle grew louder, more distorted, until it sounded like a scream. The next morning, the teenagers' beds were empty. The windows were wide open, the curtains swaying gently in the breeze. On the floor, near the door, they found a bone whistle. It was cracked, and the faint sound of a whistle could be heard, soft and melodic, almost like a lullaby. And as their families listened, they realized it wasn't just a whistle, It was a voice whispering their names. The town was on the brink of collapse. The disappearances had become so frequent that people were afraid to leave their homes. The police were powerless, and the media had stopped reporting on the story. It was as if the town had been erased from the map. But one man refused to give up. His name was Daniel, a former detective who had retired after the original disappearances. He had always suspected that there was more to the story, and now he was determined to uncover the truth. Daniel spent weeks researching the Whistling Man, poring over old records, and interviewing the few people who were still willing to talk. He learned that the Whistling Man was not just a curse. He was a manifestation of a dark ritual that had been performed decades ago by a group of cultists who had worshipped him as a god. The cult had been destroyed, but the Whistling Man had survived, feeding on the fear and despair of the town. And now, he was stronger than ever. Daniel knew he had to stop him, but he couldn't do it alone. He reached out to Agnes, the old woman who had given Sarah's mother the bone whistle. Together, they devised a plan to banish the Whistling Man once and for all. That night, Daniel and Agnes went to the old mill, armed with the bone whistle and a vial of Agnes's most potent potion. The mill was eerily quiet, the air thick with tension. They could feel the Whistling Man's presence, watching them from the shadows. Agnes lit the candles and began to chant, her voice low and steady. Daniel blew the bone whistle, the sound sharp and piercing. The shadows shifted, and the Whistling Man appeared, his glowing eyes fixed on them. "You don't belong here," Daniel said, his voice firm. "Leave this place and never return." The Whistling Man tilted his head, as if considering his words. Then he lunged at them, his long, bony fingers reaching for their throats. Agnes threw the potion at him, and the Whistling Man let out a deafening scream. His form began to dissolve, the shadows unraveling like threads. But before he disappeared completely, he turned to Daniel and whispered something, a name, a date, a location. Daniel's blood ran cold. He knew what it meant. The Whistling Man wasn't gone. He was just biding his time. The next morning, the town was quiet. The disappearances had stopped, and the whistle was never heard again. Daniel and Agnes were hailed as heroes, but they knew the truth. The Whistling Man was still out there, waiting for the right moment to return. And when he did, he would be stronger than ever. Daniel kept the bone whistle, just in case. But he knew it was only a matter of time before he heard the whistle again, soft and melodic, almost like a lullaby. And when he did, he would be ready. Thank you all for watching. Please like and subscribe for more scary stories.